Her name was Mary Springham. She was 21 years old in 1787. She was convicted at the Old Bailey of stealing 2 guineas, 9 shillings, and a snuff box. The total value of what she took came to approximately £186 in today's money. For that, she was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia, placed aboard a convict ship called the Lady Penrhyn, and sailed out of the Thames into a journey of 15,000 miles that no one had prepared her for and no authority had seen fit to make survivable. The bilges below deck rotted with waste. Rats shared the space with the women. The ship's surgeon recorded 48 deaths on that first crossing. Mary Springham survived. Many women on later ships did not. She came from Newgate Prison. That is where this story begins. Newgate stood at the corner of Newgate Street and Old Bailey, just inside the old Roman wall of the city. It had been a prison since 1188, over 600 years by the time Mary Springham passed through its gates. In that time it had burned down, been rebuilt, been stormed during the Gordon riots of 1780, been rebuilt again, and never once become a place where a human being could be held without degradation. A grand jury presentment from 1813, an official legal document, not a reformers' polemic, found that the female felons' ward held 120 women in a space designed for 60. These women were, in the words of that same document, destitute and in rags, without bedding, many without shoes. Approximately 30 people died inside Newgate every year from disease alone. In 1789, 92 inmates died in a single year from jail fever, out of a total prison population of roughly 600. Physicians frequently refused to enter. People passing on the street outside held their noses. The women inside had no warders of their own sex. Male guards moved through the female quarters without restriction. Elizabeth Fry, writing in her diary about what she witnessed, described rape and sexual exploitation as routine. She named it plainly, which was almost without precedent for a woman of her class writing for any official record in 1813. The authorities received her words and did nothing with them for a decade. I want to lay out what Elizabeth Fry actually did, in sequence, so that what was done with her work, or rather, what was not done, can be measured against it precisely. She was born Elizabeth Gurney in Norwich on the 21st of May 1780. Her family were Quakers and bankers. She married Joseph Fry in 1800 and had 11 children, the last born in 1822. In 1813, a French-American Quaker named Stephen Grellet asked her to visit the women's section of Newgate. The prison jailer told her the prisoners were dangerous and that she should not go inside alone. She went in anyway. She found 300 women and their children, some of whom had been born inside Newgate and had never known any other life, crowded into a few rooms. Some had not yet received a trial. Some were awaiting transportation. She called the place hell above ground. She came back the next day with food and clothing. Then she came back again. For 3 years, domestic circumstances prevented her from doing more. In 1816 she returned, funded a school inside the prison for the children living with their mothers, and began what would become the central project of her public life. In 1817 she founded the Association for the Reformation of the Female Prisoners in Newgate. 12 women, mostly Quakers, who organized practical help, materials for sewing and knitting, which the women could sell to earn their own small income, reading instruction, a degree of dignity in daily routine. Rather than imposing rules by authority, she proposed the rules and asked the women to vote on them. Every account of the change in atmosphere inside the female ward, from prison officials, from visitors, from the women themselves, reports the same thing. It worked. Word of what she had done reached Parliament. In 1818, Elizabeth Fry became the first woman in British history to give evidence before a House of Commons Select Committee. She sat before those men and described in specific terms what she had seen, the conditions, the exploitation, the absence of any provision for the basic welfare of women and children held inside a building operated by the state. She named what she needed changed. She was precise. She was credible. She had 5 years of direct, documented experience behind every sentence she spoke. The committee received her evidence. The years passed. During those years, The Home Secretary was Viscount Sidmouth, Henry Addington, 1st Viscount Sidmouth, who had been Prime Minister between 1801 and 1804. Sidmouth held the Home Office from 1812 to 1822. He was the minister responsible for prisons. Elizabeth Fry brought her findings to his attention repeatedly. He rejected her criticism of the prison system. The word used in the historical record is rejected, not deferred, not noted, rejected. Records from 1809 show that Newgate held nearly 800 inmates. By 1817, 4 years after Fry first entered the female ward, the number had risen past 1,000 souls held in a building designed for 460. Sidmouth was the man who could have ordered change. He was the man who chose not to. He left office in 1822. His successor was Robert Peel. Peel was different in manner but the same in result, at least for a time. He was receptive to Fry's proposals in a way Sidmouth had not been. He passed the Jails Act in 1823, which mandated the separation of male and female prisoners, required female warders to guard female inmates, prohibited the use of irons and manacles, and provided for regular chaplain visits. It ended the death penalty for 130 crimes. It put jailers on a salary, ending the practice by which prison guards had been entirely dependent on fees extracted from prisoners, money for having your shackles loosened, money for a blanket, money for a piece of bread that hadn't yet gone stale. Guards had been, in effect, licensed extortionists. The Jails Act of 1823 was the direct legislative product of Elizabeth Fry's work. She had spent 10 years documenting the problem, building an organization, testifying before Parliament, and producing evidence that could not be dismissed. The Act bore the marks of everything she had argued for. On paper it was substantial. In practice it was largely ineffective. It contained no mechanism to ensure its provisions were followed. It did not apply to town jails or debtors' prisons. The one change widely and successfully adopted was the separation of male from female inmates. Ohio State University, the Act applied to only 130 of the largest prisons. Small prisons ignored it altogether. There were no inspectors to enforce it. A law without inspectors is a statement of preference. That is what Parliament chose to pass. Fry knew it immediately. In 1835, giving evidence before a select committee of the House of Lords, she described prisons across England and Wales as places that remained, despite the Jails Act, schools for crime. She used that phrase in a formal parliamentary setting. She described women held without instruction, without employment, without classification, deteriorating into what she called a most low and deplorable state of morals. The Jails Act had been in place for 12 years by then. She was telling the Lords of Parliament that it had not done what it was supposed to do. She was right. Not until the Prisons Act of 1835 were inspectors actually appointed. Not until then were all prisons brought under central control. That is 22 years after she first walked into Newgate. Let me address the counterargument here, because it is usually presented as a form of historical sympathy. The argument goes like this: change takes time, especially systemic change. The passage of the 1823 Act was itself remarkable for an era when women had no vote, no formal political standing, and no recognized public role in policymaking. Fry achieved more than almost anyone in her position could have. To criticize the pace of reform is to misunderstand the structural constraints of the age. There is truth in this, but the argument becomes dishonest when it is used to dissolve responsibility into the atmosphere of the times. The people responsible for the conditions inside Newgate Prison were not abstractions. They were Viscount Sidmouth, who had a name, a salary, a title, and a desk, and who rejected a documented record of rape and squalor because he did not want to be troubled by it. They were the members of the 1818 Parliamentary Committee who received Fry's testimony, acknowledged it, and then waited 5 years before passing incomplete legislation with no enforcement mechanism. They were the magistrates and jailers who continued to run prisons in violation of the 1823 Act for years after it passed, knowing there were no inspectors coming, knowing there would be no consequences. The Times did not create Viscount Sidmouth's indifference. Viscount Sidmouth created it. One more person deserves to be named here. Her name is not well remembered. She was a woman called Anne Burnett, and she appears in the records of the Newgate Women's Ward in the early 1820s as one of the inmates Fry worked with directly. She had been convicted of theft. She had a child inside the prison with her. The records do not give the child's name or age. What the records do show, because Fry's organization kept them, is that Anne Burnett was taught to read, learned to sew patchwork, earned a small sum from the sale of her work, and was eventually transported to Australia. Fry visited every convict ship bound for Australia for more than 25 years, to ensure the women and children on board received food and water and were not stripped of what little remained to them. She was there when the ships left the dock. She was one woman, boarding government vessels, demanding that the people inside them be treated as people. The government that owned those ships did not share her urgency until decades after she started asking. Anne Burnett arrived in Australia. What happened to her there is not recorded. The wider picture is this. Between 1788 and 1827, the coroner for the City of London investigated at least 1,116 prison deaths, an average of 28 per year. Of the 816 deaths in Newgate alone between 1788 and 1837, roughly 10% were people who had not yet stood trial. They died inside a prison while waiting to be told whether they were guilty of anything. The coroner's records frequently listed cause of death as natural or by the visitation of God, a phrase that, as one researcher noted, helped absolve prison authorities from any suspicion of neglect. Natural. The language of inevitability applied to outcomes that were entirely the result of human decisions, to understaff, to underfund, to overpack, to ignore the woman who kept coming back with documented evidence of what was happening inside. Fry died on the 12th of October 1845, in Ramsgate, of a stroke. She was 65. The sailors of the Ramsgate Coast Guard flew their flag at half-mast, a gesture that until that day had been reserved for the deaths of reigning monarchs. More than 1,000 people stood in silence at her burial. The Lord Mayor of London convened a meeting to determine a fitting memorial. An asylum for young women discharged from London prisons opened in 1849 in her name, at 195 Mare Street in Hackney. In 2002, her image appeared on the Bank of England £5 note, shown reading to prisoners at Newgate. In 2016, her image was removed and replaced with Winston Churchill. That is the sequence of honours. It should be held alongside the sequence of facts. First visit to Newgate in 1813, evidence to Parliament in 1818, inadequate legislation in 1823 with no enforcement, continued deterioration documented again in 1835, inspectors finally appointed that same year, Fry dead 10 years later, having spent 3 decades cataloguing a crisis that the people with formal power to end it addressed at the pace that suited their political convenience. There is something specific that the official story tends not to linger on. Fry's diaries are explicit about the sexual abuse of women inside Newgate by male guards. She did not write about it obliquely. She wrote about it as a documented, ongoing practice that the prison authorities were aware of and had chosen not to address. She was the first woman to present this evidence to a parliamentary committee. The parliamentary committee sat, listened, and then returned to their business. The men who ran Newgate Prison knew what was happening on the female ward. The Home Office knew, because Fry had told them. Sidmouth knew, because Fry had told him specifically. The decision not to act was not ignorance. It was a choice. When you ask who benefited from the conditions inside Newgate, the answer is not complicated. Prison warders who extracted fees from prisoners benefited. The vendors who sold alcohol inside the prison, a legal, documented trade, benefited. The contractors who supplied the prison with food that the historical record describes as frequently inedible profited from government contracts that no one was scrutinizing. The magistrates and city officials who administered Newgate were not paying for it from their own incomes. The cost of doing nothing was borne entirely by the women inside. Fry's organization, the British Ladies' Society for Promoting the Reformation of Female Prisoners, became the first nationwide women's organization in Britain. It spread to branches in Russia, Italy, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The Empress of Russia corresponded with Fry directly. Frederick William IV of Prussia visited her at work in Newgate in 1842 and told his reluctant courtiers he would personally go to the jail. Queen Victoria granted her several private audiences and contributed money to her cause. The rulers of Europe were more willing to engage with what Elizabeth Fry was saying than the Home Secretary sitting in an office a 15-minute carriage ride from the prison. That specific distance, the distance between what one woman documented and what the men with authority chose to do with her documentation, is the real subject of this story. She told them in 1813. She told them in 1818. She told them again in 1835. The Jails Act passed in 1823 without inspectors. The prisons continued. The women inside them continued to die. The coroner kept writing, "By the visitation of God," at the top of his forms. Elizabeth Fry is on the £5 note. Then she was taken off it. Viscount Sidmouth has a Wikipedia page that describes his career as Home Secretary without once using the words she wrote in her diary about the female ward of Newgate Prison while he held that office. What she documented, the men who could act on it filed away. What they filed away, the women inside Newgate continued to live inside. And the gap between those two facts, between knowing and choosing, was not a failure of the times. It was a decision made by specific people with specific power who knew exactly what they were deciding.